Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and welcome to my guide to Omega Deltascape V2 on the Savage difficulty. The mechanics are mostly similar to normal mode, but there are quite a few additions and changes as well as higher incoming damage. Let's take the time to discuss the more important differences here. The most important change from normal mode is 100 Gs. In normal, it automatically lowered everyone to ground level. On Savage, a circle will appear around the two players with the highest aggro on the boss, and you must stack with those marked players in order to be lowered to ground level if you are floating. You'll pretty much want to do this every time 100 Gs is cast. Of course, Evil Sphere, the Tank Buster, and Gravitational Wave, which is room-wide AoE plus a casting interruption, hit a lot harder, so make sure to mitigate these with damage shields, cooldowns such as Addle or Reprisal. Gravitational Wave can be especially threatening since it usually occurs around the same time as other AoEs. Speaking of tanks, I prefer to keep the boss positioned close to the middle of the room whenever a mechanic is finished, so move him there and face him away from the group once you're sure it's safe to. Just don't place him right on the middle, as it can make seeing the safe spot for anti-lights a bit more troublesome. The boss's Conal Cleave also puts stacks of Gradual Petrify on the tanks. You'll want to tank swap this at 2 stacks, as 3 stacks will instantly kill the tank. There's usually an Evil Sphere that precedes the 3rd stack, so I prefer to do my tank swaps in the middle of the Evil Sphere cast time, as it ensures that the previous tank doesn't take any auto attacks after the Tank Buster, and the new tank doesn't have to eat the Tank Buster plus auto attack plus cleave all back to back. Anti-Light has only the more difficult patterns from normal mode, including the pattern where everyone stacks middle on ground level, and the pattern with the higher anti-lights comboed with other attacks, such as Earthquake. Gravitational Manipulation will now mark 2 players with split damage AoEs in Savage, one on the higher elevation and one on the lower elevation. Assuming all 8 people are alive, 1 healer and 1 DPS will be marked and placed at their designated elevation. Simplest way to do this mechanic: keep all the DPS on the ground, put all the tanks and the healers in the air. Doesn't matter who gets selected for the mechanic, as the mechanic itself will force 1 DPS and 1 healer to either ground or floating level. So long as the other 3 members of each grouping go to their designated elevations, you'll succeed every time. It also needs to be 4 low and 4 high, or everyone's going to get a Vuln stack. Now, there are other mechanics that have changed or have been added, but we'll talk about those more as we discuss the boss's actual rotation. As with normal mode, you can start the fight and float to avoid that first Earthquake. When the boss casts his first anti-light, he'll also join it with a Gravitational Wave. Normally that doesn't seem worth mentioning, but I feel like it's important to practice mitigating those waves, especially if you are playing in the Raid or Party Finder. So, shields, Addle, Reprisal, something to lower the raid-wide damage. Gravitational Manipulation plus 6 Fulms under is the first real combo attack. Remember, DPS down, tanks and healers up. Once the split AoEs hit the party, make sure those on the lower elevation raise up out of 6 Fulms. Next up is Maniacal Probe, which works quite a bit different on Savage and is one of those mechanics I waited to talk about after the beginning. For Maniacal Probe number 1, all of the tanks and healers will be marked, and each mark will drop a probe in the player's location when it wears off. The probe dropping does some decent damage on its own, so make sure not to be stacked on top of each other with each other's markers. After the probes are dropped and the boss casts Epicenter, the probes start shaking wildly with eyes over their head. Eventually, one of them will stop wiggling and lose its marker. Your party should run to the wall closest to that calmed probe, in order to avoid the giant Epicenter AoEs that are about to hit the party. Now originally, the probes were thought to be the center point of the Epicenter AoEs that come out several seconds later. For this reason in the footage here, we mark each cardinal direction and assign each player a designated spot that they will take their probe to. Thanks to the Reddit post by main_tank, the community is now aware that the probes are simply used to detect safe zones on the arena, and are not the actual center point for the AoE itself. You can place them far closer to the center of the room as seen in this diagram provided in that same Reddit post, and still execute the same mechanic, just run all the way to the wall closest to the one that stops wiggling. This allows for greater uptime on the boss, which is especially important in pug groups. And with all the probes in the center, it's far easier for your entire team to see where the safe zone is going to be, instead of wildly adjusting the camera to attempt to find it last second. Thanks, main tank. For Maniacal Probe number 1, while doing the probe mechanic, the boss will do Death Gaze, instantly killing anyone looking at him, so make sure you're not. After a Gravitational Wave, he will also do 100 Gs, which you'll want everyone to be lowered by. I recommend locating the safe wall and run to and stacking there, all to be lowered to the ground while dodging Epicenter. Now, I personally prefer to drop the probes a little bit further out, around where the wagon wheels are on the arena at the 4 cardinal directions. This still keeps them all on the screen, but I also use them as a marker for the stack point for 100 Gs for probe number 1. We all stack on where the actual probe is, we all get lowered, and then we quickly run to the wall before the epicenter AoEs go off. After that, there will be another gravitational wave, followed by some tank busters. Next up is negative 100 Gs, which operates similarly to normal mode. The only difference is, all 4 DPS will get an AoE marker that you want to avoid stacking up. We simply designate each DPS to a different spot ahead of time in one of the 2 safe zones. As a reminder, there's a safe zone to the north of the arena and a safe zone to the south of the arena, so make sure you don't get turned around based on what the boss's position is. Look at the cardinal directions. You can set this up however you want, but here is how I've had a lot of my random groups do it. He'll also channel a death gaze when you land, so make sure that while you're positioning for all this you keep that in mind, and look away when you get back to ground level. Next up is the final new mechanic of the fight. He'll do an anti-light plus gravitational wave, but after the wave, he'll do a split damage AoE called Long Drop on one of the 4 DPS while marking the tanks and healers with unstable gravity. Unstable gravity simply explodes for high AoE damage around the marked player when it expires. Luckily, the Long Drop marker knocks away players who are floating, so if all 4 tanks and healers float near their maniacal probe markers within the split damage AoE, they'll split the damage with the groups before being knocked back to each of the 4 cardinal directions of the room. Unconfident tanks and healers can also choose to simply run to the designated wall without float as long as the DPS and remaining tanks and healers have mitigation tools to split the damage. After this, the fight just repeats itself with all the mechanics you've seen, plus a few new patterns. The anti-light plus earthquake combo starts returning from normal mode, as well as anti-light plus 100 Gs. For the earthquake ones, make sure to float as soon as you see the anti-light dissolve. For the 100 G ones, just make sure everyone's on ground level. Maniacal Probe will return 2 more times as well, for a maximum of 3 uses from the boss. Maniacal Probe number 2 targets all 4 DPS instead of the tanks and healers, but otherwise functions the same. Designate 4 spots to drop the probes and run to the safe wall when one of them stops wiggling. Maniacal Probe number 3 goes back to being tanks and healers. One difference is, with probes 2 and 3, is the boss does gravitational manipulation during them, so DPS down and tanks healers up when you see those stack AoEs, and make sure you're running towards the wall. The anti-light plus long drop AoEs also happen immediately after the epicenter AoEs as well, and basically immediately following Maniacal Probes 2 and 3. So after you see the epicenters explode, have everyone stack mid again. Long drop number 2 targets the DPS with unstable gravity, and long drop number 3 targets the tanks and healers again. Just float and get knocked back towards your designated cardinal direction, and it'll be fine. It's not any more complicated the second and third time than it was the first time. After the third long drop is also a Death Gaze plus 6 foams under, followed by a gravitational wave. I've seen many pickup groups get caught off guard by this individual gravitational wave, so keep an eye on HP and make sure to use your personal mitigation tools. After the last long drop is a series of some of the easier combos the boss can do, such as gravitational manipulation plus 6 foams under like he used at the beginning of the fight, or anti-light plus earthquake. There is sometimes an additional negative 100 Gs, and sometimes there isn't. I'm not really sure why I've had this negative 100 Gs happen so infrequently, but if you do get it, it feels like the boss takes longer to actually enrage, so if you do get it, do it the same way you did it the first time, and bam, you've got some extra time to DPS once you land. That's going to be a wrap from my guide to Omega Deltascape V2 on the Savage difficulty. If you're looking for a boss rotation guide, be sure to look in the description of the video, just like with my V1 Savage guide. Be on the lookout for 3 and 4, and well, best of luck to those of you in the Party Finder and those in Statics. Thank you for watching, and until next time, take care.